Let me get that clear. Did you say that this council cannot take any health concerns into consideration?
The federal law on point is that we are allowed to determine whether a proposed project will comply with the FCC rules. And if the answer is yes, that is the end of a local government's exploration of the subject. If the answer is yes, that ends our exploration. To go beyond that, we're not allowed to adopt our own standards. We're not even allowed to adopt the FCC standards as our own. This is an area that is subject to field preemption by the Congress vested that field preemption with the FCC to establish these rules. So our authority is very narrowly defined. Now that said, the City of Thousand Oaks has consistently evaluated wireless projects for compliance with the rules. And in fact, in some cases, for example, tonight, where there are reasons to want to do an additional evaluation, we've proposed as a condition tonight to do post-construction testing to make sure that the proposed safety barriers are placed in the right location. That is more than virtually every other jurisdiction does. So we take that authority to its furthest level within the bounds of federal and actually it's also in state law.
Do you know the process that was used by the FCC to determine health standards and what is permissible and healthy and what is unhealthy, if I'm using the correct terminology?
Well, I think the better healthy and unhealthy is really not good terminology here. We at local governments look at compliance. Now, in answer to your question, in 1997, when the FCC adopted the standards that they have reaffirmed a couple of months ago, they went, let me frame this by saying, I co-authored the FCC's National Guide to Local Governments on the rules back when they were originally put out. So I do have some knowledge about how these rules came about. And essentially the FCC went out to radiological health organizations. They looked at standards in other countries. They consulted with the wireless industry, which would be subject to these rules. They looked at other standards within the government and essentially came up with what they felt was the appropriate standards for the United States at that time. And those standards have just recently been reaffirmed, so they are current standards. But the standards were not created by the wireless industry, nor were they created by the government. They were created by an inquiry about what's happening around the world, what the wireless technology, the wireless radiological health experts had to say, the military. So that's how these rules were originally developed.
As a result of their inquiry, who was it that did the work, the analysis, the study to determine what is safe and what is not safe?
Well, the FCC did its basic research, consulting with other agencies, and then its experts in-house came up with the standard. The standard, by the way, is set at roughly 2% of the level where you could actually measure a physiological change because of exposure to radio frequency. So there's a 50 times margin built into the FCC rules. But that was done internally at the FCC in consultation with the experts that I've described.
Well, if this started in 96, has nothing changed since 1996 as far as the equipment itself is concerned that might warrant having further study and further standards or modification of standards?
And that's exactly what the FCC just concluded. They did that inquiry, but basically you're still dealing with radio waves and power levels and frequencies. Those power levels and frequencies are the principal two components. Now, the way you modulate the signal I don't want to get into a deep dive on technology here, but the way that the signal is manipulated is one element. But I will tell you that the FCC standards are based on not averages, but essentially 100% duty cycle. In other words, full continuous wave exposure. So it's a worst case rule. Has the technology changed since 97? Yes. We've gone through multiple generations of wireless facilities. Have the basic physics of radio frequency transmission and its impacts in the environment changed? No.
Well, it just seems strange to me that what applied in 96 would be, completely up to date. Now, these waves, just one more question. I don't mean to prolong this, Mr. Mayor. These radio waves, if they did have a harmful effect, what would be the nature of that? Have you explored that area?
Well, I will tell you what the effect of the radio waves is. And as for harm, that's a different subject altogether, because again, at local government, we're restricted to looking at compliance issues. The effect of radio waves at differing frequencies, the primary effect on the human body is heating, a rise in temperature of the human body through exposure to radio waves. Again, the FCC has set its standards back in 97 and reaffirmed them now to essentially provide a 50-time safety margin between the maximum a person can be exposed to without knowing that they're being exposed, in other words, members of the general population, and that point where you can measure a physiological change. There are people that talk about non-thermal effects of RF. It's outside of our purview to consider those because they're not part of the FCC regulations. In fact, the FCC regulations, or the inquiry that just was completed, looked at that issue, and the FCC declined to take that into consideration.
So it's your conclusion that this is an exact science. Is that correct? And it can make exact conclusions that are verifiable as laws of physics or other chemistries or other laws?
Compliance with the FCC rules is a measurable test. And in fact, we do that first on the paper side because the site isn't built. You can't measure it.
No, I just meant in general, the effect of these waves.
Yeah.
And if there's a safe distance or an unsafe distance from the site or so forth.
The FCC tells us at what point the public can be around a cell site with no controls whatsoever. The project tonight is conditioned to make sure that that distance is based on the actual transmissions, not just relying on the calculations that Verizon has proposed. So that's why we go to that second step. Is it an exact science? Nothing in nature is exact, which is why we do the due diligence that we're proposing tonight.
Well, I don't want to belabor this, Mr. Mayor, but I would just say that there seems to be a difference of opinion on this matter. Thank you. That was not an applause statement.